All right, welcome, Jason. Let
We're
me
back.
just get the link back out to everyone here. Hold on for a second. So it's live. We have one viewer. Thank you guys for switching over. Let me just get the links out for everyone really quick. And I'm just going to update the blog post and we will continue here in a second. Sorry, everyone. Google dropped us really quickly there. So just give us one moment and we will start back up where we left off. Just give me a second. Jason, while we're going, do you mind just giving people a little bit of background information, and I'll just get this, the link out to everyone. So just give folks a little bit about your background, and we'll start to transition to another image here. So when you're ready, you can share that.
Sure. Just a little bit more about me. I'm in Florida, and a lot of my photography is done down here. We're fortunate to have a huge amount of wildlife and scenic opportunities. And then over the past year, I've also been absorbing more adventure type photography into my particular portfolio, learning all the techniques to also capture people interacting with nature, because we see so much of that here as well. I really got started with birds. That was kind of what hooked me at first, and then that expanded to wildlife, and then that expanded to landscapes, and really now I just love anything to do with nature, and I'll take a photograph of anything that walks, crawls, swims, flies in front of my lens. I'm also a big believer that there's a three-step process that we have: finding the photo opportunity, which includes the creation part, the imagination part, the actual in the camera, and then the digital darkroom. And that while we create the photo in the camera, we finish it in the darkroom. And so the idea that we hear all these no words, manipulation and photoshopping and things like that. If you look at digital photography and understand what a raw file is, you have to process it. It is just raw information captured by the little computer that is in your camera. And if you don't process it, you haven't finished your photo. So I think that's a really important thing, that we need to not think of things like perfectly clear as bad things, that they're part of what helps us finish the photo. Switch over here. Okay, let's see. All right, can you see my peer picture here?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, so as an example of pre-visualization, to kind of go into what's happening in this particular scene. This is another sunrise shot. You'll get that impression I'm out early a lot, so anybody who comes and comes shoot with me, you will be up really early. I'm going to warn you now. And this is Reddington Pier. This is one of the old Florida classic wooden piers here on the Gulf Coast. And you can see how flat and calm the water is here. There's a lot of parts in Florida where you could walk out a mile and probably not get waist deep, and this is definitely one of them. This particular morning, I had been planning on this for months. This was the morning of a full moon, and we saw the supermoon that morning, and then this is after the moon had set. So I wanted to show this one in particular because on its surface it's kind of a flat picture, but there's really a lot of subtle color to it that you can really perk up nicely in as we're going through in perfectly clear. Now again, I tend to start with my intelligent auto just to see what it's going to do, but in this particular case, I'm going to lean a little bit more towards high contrast over the high def, just to see how it works between the two images. And what you'll see with the two is they're basically changed the way they're pulling out details in the shadows. In this case, I'm not quite as worried about pulling out details in the shadow under the pier. That's not a real high priority to me, but certainly pulling out a little bit more shadow, a little more detail in the waves, and really what's a big focal part of the image, which is that foreground, a really nice reflection that's right there in front of us. So as I'm working with these different sliders, that's, I'm always thinking, what is my final product? What is it I'm trying to tell here? In this case, this is a very serene scene. We've got a lot of pastel colors, which kind of reinforce that. Let's stick with that theme. I don't want to turn those waters into looking like a choppy, raging torrent. I want to have them look like the calm, serene place that it was. So anything I'm doing in terms of that is to enhance that mood and that feeling. It has picked up tint. You'll see that a lot of times with the sunrise shots because they naturally are tinted. In this particular case, I want to really keep the pink that's showing up here. So I may err on minimum when I'm looking at that. I certainly don't want to remove all of that. I just want to make sure that the color is correct for the scene. And as I'm going through there, then that's where I want to see that I'm still reinforcing that whole mood through that scene. You can see I have a booger on the frame there too. A little bit of a water spot.
That can happen when you're out roaming in the waves.
Exactly. Well, I will say that the reality was that up on top of here is a bait shop, and all of a sudden they flushed the bait coolers, which the pipe comes straight from the pier down to the people standing underneath of it if you are so unlucky to be there.
So you got fish guts getting the shot.
Yeah, I narrowly avoided having about 50 gallons of fish gut juice dumped on my head. That's the glamour of nature photography.
Well, Jason, I think this has done a nice job of showing folks some of the techniques that you use on landscape photography. Let's switch a little bit to nature photography for a moment.
Sure.
And obviously, landscapes can have nature in them. And, landscapes themselves are a type of nature photography, but you do a type of portraiture with animals being your subject. So talk about this, because this is a little bit harder than landscape photography, in my opinion, because landscape photography, you don't have to find the subject. You usually discover it, you drive to it, and it's there. But, just driving to the forest doesn't mean that you're going to encounter wildlife up close.
No. And wildlife photography involves having to be a lot of different kinds of ologist. It's not just knowing the photography side of things, how to work your camera, but you have to know how wildlife survives, what they do on a daily basis. Every animal has body language. Every animal has cycles, and there's a pretty basic format for life on this planet of following a life cycle, and that they're going to reproduce, have young, those young are raised, or they grow up to create the next generation, and then the cycle repeats itself. However, within that basic cycle, there's almost infinite variation in it. And that's where part of the fun to me in wildlife photography is capturing all those little intimate moments that go into an animal's life. But to actually find and capture them, you have to be a good naturalist. That's number one. And to me, number two is that you really respect and love what you're taking pictures of. And when you do that, it shows in your work. So as an example, if I want to go and find certain types of birds, I need to know where they live, what time of year they're going to be here, what they like to eat. All those things are going to improve my odds. And it sounds bad, but being a professional wildlife photographer is a little bit like being a professional gambler sometimes. You don't know what you're going to run into. Certainly there is a little bit of luck involved, but the more you know about the animal, the more you improve your odds of finding them.
So as you're out and about and you're searching for animals, are there any things that improve your odds? Do you study time of day? Do you visit locations multiple times? What are you looking for so you can really find and engage your subject?
Yeah, what I'm looking for, there's number one is knowing where they're likely to live. Obviously, I'm not going to look for a polar bear in Florida outside of the zoo. They're just not going to live here. But more specifically, within Florida, different animals like different ecosystems. So, as an example, the picture I'm going to pull up next is a black-bellied whistling duck. Okay, black-bellied whistling ducks are primarily a freshwater species. Knowing that, I've just cut out half of the water that I can encounter in Florida, and I'm only going to focus on freshwater to find them. If it's during a dry period in the state, I know there's not a lot of surface water. This is a duck, it likes water. So I need to know where that water is. And then because it's a type of tree duck, they typically like to roost in trees. So I'm going to look for any kind of large body of fresh water that has a lot of dead trees around it, waterlogged old snags, things like that. And that's going to massively improve my odds of finding a black-bellied whistling duck. The next part of that is migratory patterns, because most waterfowl migrates. So knowing at what time of year they're going to leave from what place they spend time in the summer to what place they spend time in the winter. We're fortunate they spend a lot of time here in Central Florida in the winter. So knowing those different things really helps me find them. The next part of it is not trying to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of people who study these animals, who know a tremendous amount about it. And, whatever your feelings may be on hunting or not, quite frankly, hunters have been studying these animals for millennia. And so picking up on a lot of the techniques that they use to find these animals, that's a lot of the same techniques that I would use as well.
Once we found the subject, how do you integrate yourself into the scene so that you get the types of pictures that you want? I imagine that there's a lot of longer lens work here, both for your safety and the subject's comfort, but walk us through that process, and then let's take a look at a couple of images and how you enhance them.
Yeah, sure. Typically, it all comes back to the type of animal and the type of ecosystem that that I'm dealing with. And if you want, I can actually let me go ahead and share the screen I'm on at the moment so that they can see some of these animals I'm talking about, because some people may have never seen them before. And come on, it's thinking, maybe.
I see it. It's there.
Okay. So here I was talking about the black-bellied whistling duck. Beautiful duck. They're just beautiful, great coloration, very animated. They squabble a lot amongst themselves. So I've done a bit of photography with them. That was a mule deer. So with any animal, the first thing I'm going to do is you have to determine whether this is an animal that you need to hide from to effectively photograph it, or whether it's one that you need to have accept your presence there. Ideally, what I want with every animal is for them to just ignore me, that they don't care that I'm there, they don't see me as a threat, they don't see me as food, they just ignore me. And so what I'm going to do with a bird like this is, I know he's out in the open, he sees me from a long ways away. Most of these animals have far better senses than we do. And in this case, this bird knew that I was there. Unless I'm going to get into and set up a blind before sunrise and hunker down in it until they show up, they're going to see me from quite a ways away. So what I want to do with my behaviors and anything that I do in close vicinity to that bird is not come off as a predator. So one of the things is, I don't walk straight at it locking eyes with it. I'm going to loop back and forth. So if I see that bird at, say, 100 yards away, I'm going to start walking and basically zigzagging back and forth, each zig getting a little bit closer, and then I may take a few frames just so it hears the camera going off. That process lets it decide whether I'm a predator or not. And a lot of animals would err on the side of caution, but they don't necessarily want to leave wherever they're at. They're typically there for a reason. They're either resting there, they're raising their family there, they're feeding there. So if that duck is in this spot, there's a reason it's there, and it probably doesn't want to leave.
Now, do you use the quiet shutter mode of your camera or silent shooting mode that many cameras support to minimize that noise?
It will depend on the animal. For some that are very sensitive to noise, certainly, and certainly if it's in a camera trap or something like that. But sometimes I actually want it to hear the noise, and once they hear that noise, realize that it's not a danger noise. Okay, so it's a little backward snaking, and I know there are those that will say, no, that's crazy talk. But that seems to work with me. And Florida birds are some of them are very tolerant. Ducks are a notoriously difficult species to photograph because they are hunted all along their flyways, so they associate people with danger in a lot of cases. So in this case, this particular bird, by doing that loop back and forth, not acting like a predator, not trying to hide, because that almost would seem more disturbing and more dangerous to this animal, it was very accepting of my presence to the point where I got very, reasonably close that I could take full frame pictures. And this is at about 500 millimeters. Love my Tamron 150 to 600. That's one of my favorite lenses. I used to haul around a big prime. I don't do that as much anymore, partly for some health reasons, but partly because I just love the versatility of having a big zoom. So that if I go from photographing this duck, which is fairly small in the frame, to photographing the white-tailed deer that was standing on the edge of the bank 50 yards away, I have that versatility to zoom in or out.
Well, this is actually a good time. We have a question from one of the people watching the webinar, and they say, what is the minimal kit that you would bring with you? The photographer was honest, like many of us, and said, I often bring too much gear. So you mentioned one of your favorite lenses of having that versatility of range. Is there anything else that matters here that that are must-haves? I imagine you have to strike a balance of having what you need versus not having enough.
Yes. With all of this, I like to simplify. I used to be one of the guys who carried the entire B&H store on my back and, would try to walk out in the swamp with it, and it was just too much. So I tend to err on the side of having one body, one lens, and a backup lens depending on what I'm shooting. Now, if I'm specifically going for wildlife, then I'm going to simplify more. And I may give up opportunities to photograph a nice landscape because I want to have minimal gear to go out and photograph the wildlife that I'm encountering. So typically I'm going to go out with my camera body. Personally, I use a Canon 5D Mark IV. And I like the full frame. No, I don't use a crop. I know a lot of wildlife photographers that do, and that's fine. I don't disagree with that, but because I shoot a really broad range of nature, I like having that big full frame for my landscapes and being able to switch back and forth.
Any other equipment, such as, do you bring any blinds or safety gear or rain gear for yourself or anything to hide behind when you're shooting?
Yeah, typically I always go out with a day pack, no matter what I'm doing. And that day pack always has a liter of water in it. Number one, most important thing that we as nature photographers forget is to stay hydrated. I always make sure I have a full extra set of batteries, extra memory cards, always have rain gear in the bag for the camera. I use a storm jacket. And I use the largest size so that it can adapt down because they do collapse nicely. And I always have a small first aid kit and a headlamp in my bag. I'm a big believer in being prepared. I'm actually a wilderness first aid trained, as well as Florida Master Naturalist. So those things help keep me safe and also help keep the people I take out safe as well. So in terms of gear, I go pretty minimal on my camera equipment for something like this because I know that I'm going to want long lenses, the camera, the memory cards, but then certainly having some extra safety equipment as well, just to stay safe out there.
Jason, why don't you go ahead and open up one more picture for editing in Perfectly Clear so we can give folks a couple more tips. And thank you guys who have joined us. We'll stitch the two parts of the video together so everyone can see both sides. And I see you got a great photo there that we're going to take a look at here in a moment. One of the things that I think is an important step that I imagine you'll talk about is that sharpening is a nice way to bring out some of these details too.
Yes.
As we work with the subject. So that's one of the things that I like about Perfectly Clear is that it does do a nice job of bringing out some of those details. So I see here, you've opened up an image, Jason, and looks like you're going to bring up your screen here in just a second. You stop sharing your screen there for a second. If you could bring it back.
It comes.
Perfect. Awesome. So you're obviously at a longer lens length here because you're really filling the frame, but
Yes.
I love how the background has gone soft. We see nothing here about the subject other than the subject itself. So what sort of focal length and aperture are you at here for these types of shots?
Typically,
so low to the ground.
As a nature photographer, get used to being on your belly or on your knees. That is one of the things. Eye contact is key in this kind of photography, and the smaller the critter, the lower you have to go. That's the general rule of thumb. So in the case of this squirrel, who is the happiest creature I've ever photographed, I think he's just ecstatic with that acorn. In this case, I'm laying on my belly, and you can use a couple different things, either just laying on your stomach and hand holding, or using something like the platypod as a ground support that you can slide in front of you. It really depends what your preference is. I don't necessarily only go one method. Sometimes I will be just hand holding. Sometimes I'll be on a ground pod, so it varies quite a bit. For settings then, by getting this low, what will happen is the background behind your subject is a lot further away. So what you're seeing is that your depth of field is only including the squirrel in this case, and I'm putting my focus right on the eyes. Okay. Typically somewhere in the f5.6 to f8 range. That's one of the old sayings, the f8 and forget it. It's pretty good for wildlife, but I really like to compose that background first. So by composing the background first, you can then throw that out of focus, find something that's very pleasing to your subject and isn't competing with it. So little movements left, right, up, and down to get that background so that it's really complementary to the subject. And that's where I tend to shoot aperture priority, because I really still want to control that depth of field, which other modes wouldn't allow me to do if I was on shutter priority. I tend not to shoot manual with wildlife a lot just because of changing light conditions. Sometimes your eyes will adapt and you don't realize the light has changed. So if you were shooting on manual, all of a sudden you can end up with a dark frame. Whereas with aperture priority, I'm trusting the camera to make some choices for me, but then I can override it using my exposure compensation.
That makes sense. So what sort of enhancements are you going to do to an image like this to really bring out the subject?
Well, in an image like this, what I really want to focus on is, the focus point of this image, if, again, we're talking story, is that we have a very happy little squirrel with a nut, in this case, a live oak acorn. And so any enhancements I'm going to do is, as you mentioned, was to focus really on the sharpening aspect, because we have this really wonderful texture in the fur. I mean, it feels like you could almost just, feel how soft he is right now. And the other part of this enhancement is to make sure that that background stays complementary. And I may even add a slight vignette to it instead of removing. Sometimes we think of vignettes as a bad thing, but a very subtle vignette can really enhance the focus on your subject. And in this case, that vignette, by darkening the corner slightly, would actually place more focus on the squirrel's face here. So you can see that fur particularly, and I think I may actually be close enough that I could see my own reflection in that eyeball if I looked in there.
Yeah.
At this point, I'm probably about 8 feet away, laying on the ground, and I'm letting the squirrel come to me. I'm not trying to force myself in closer, letting the animal decide what their personal space is, so to speak. You'll end up with better results, and the animals will be much more cooperative when you're shooting with them.
And when you do sharpen, Jason, do me a favor, punch into 100% on the magnification. It's really important
Sure.
so you can accurately judge what's happening. A lot of folks sharpen, but they don't realize that if they're not at 100%, you
Right.
can't really tell what's happening on the frame. So pull back just a little bit. It looks like you're at 125. And if you click those plus and minus buttons in the upper left corner, that'll jump set increments there. So that's an easy way to get right to 100. Now, every single pixel you're seeing is exactly what's going to be output. So there's no surprises. If you sharpen and you're not at 100%, sometimes you have a tendency to over sharpen.
And the other thing here with sharpening too is that you'll notice noise has been detected. You have to walk a very fine line on your noise removal because you don't want to remove too much noise and result in a loss of detail in that fur. You're not really going to see noise in the fur. It's more in these areas that it's going to be as obvious. So, but I don't want to make this super soft in that area. Perfectly Clear does a nice job at differentiating the two between sharpening and noise removal, but still just keep that in mind that you want to be careful not to end up making this area blurry.
And there are 3 different types of noise reduction. Actually, I think 5 if you click on that. So you're using the default method there, but you do have a couple of others that are more or less aggressive depending upon what you need.
Yeah, and with wildlife, I tend to err on the side of less aggressive, unless it's a very high ISO shot with a lot of noise in it.
Well, that's looking great. I love just how that fur texture, those
detailed that is. Yeah. And that's what I, again, just slide it up a little bit, see how it looks. You don't want it to look, shall we say, crunchy, I guess is the best way to put it. So typically with something like this, I'm going to be somewhere in the 80 to 100 range. I find works pretty well. And you can see all that detail. I mean, those little claws, how detailed he really is. Okay.
Excellent. And why don't you go ahead and finish that off with a little bit of a vignette? So to jumpstart that, you'll find presets up at the top there that are kind of a nice simple way. And so the light portrait one is my favorite starting point. It's more subtle, but there are others in there that are more aggressive if you need them. And that's nice. That's just really pulling the focus to the subject by darkening the edges.
I'm just going to pull that up just a little bit. And depending on the nature of it, you can certainly change the shape. In this case, he's a little more upright. So I'm going to pull that in just a little bit versus this, which isn't going to quite work for his shape. So really look, every animal has body geometry. And that's also part of what has set my composition in this particular case. Because he's standing upright and I'm fairly close, I'm going to go with more of a vertical shot. As he turned and started to walk away, I'm probably going to flip to a more of a landscape. And so certainly with your vignette, keep that in mind as well.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, Jason, these have been some great tips. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely.
You do also lead workshops and you regularly write articles. So where are some places people can go to keep learning from you, to get some new ideas? And if they also want to learn about some of your workshops, where can they find out about those?
Yeah, certainly. Well, first off, any of my articles are available on photofocus.com. And I regularly write about things such as this, wildlife, landscapes, and post-processing as well. If you'd like to see my photography, go to on Instagram at Nature Photographer Jason. I'm on there pretty regularly. And you can go to my own personal website, www.hahn, HAHN, naturephotography.com.
Great, great. Well, Jason, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today, and I hope the folks that joined us live really got some new ideas and techniques, or if you're watching the replay, thanks for tuning in as well. Remember, you can download a free copy of Perfectly Clear to really try it out. You can run that on a 21-day trial to really see how it works for you. I would suggest that you try out the Essentials version if you're a nature and landscape photographer. If you are going to be doing a lot of portrait photography, you might enjoy the full bundle as well. And besides that, even after it expires, some of the cool technology in it will keep working in their free version, so you can give that a shot and see if that helps you out. Jason, thanks again for joining us and sharing some of your techniques. My name is Rich Harrington, and I appreciate those of you who came out and joined us live today, or if you're watching the replay. Thanks again.
Thanks all.